And good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. And thank you for the kind words of introduction. Just to start off by saying this is not usual territory for me. It's quite interesting how perhaps the work in WHO Europe is changing in recent years. There's always been a sort of a natural divide between the WHO staff in Europe, who tend to work much more to the east of the region, and many of you may not know that we have 53 member states, and that takes us right up to the frontier with China, so all the former Soviet republics and so on. So it's clear that there is, in a sense, far greater needs in many respects to the east of the region. So traditionally, people like myself have worked more to the east of the region. The Observatory on Health Systems and Policies, which is a partnership hosted by WHO, which connects very much with researchers, has traditionally tended to work much more with richer Western Europe. But this financial crisis has started to blur these lines, I think, a little bit for us. And I guess, in a sense, that's one of the reasons why I'm here. And we find ourselves working more and more with the Observatory. I mean, the financial crisis clearly has hit rich Europe much more than, if you like, poorer Europe or the east of the region. So those lines are sort of blurring, and it's very interesting to work much more closely with the Observatory in that sense. And just secondly, as Aris pointed out, in April next year, together with the Observatory and together with the Directorate of Health, the Ministry of Health in Norway, we'll be hosting a meeting which will be 4 years on from the original meeting in April 2009. And that meeting is very much about bringing the evidence to the table about the impact of the financial crisis on health and on health systems. Just a couple of words about it. It's interesting, the financial crisis is changing our work in another way as well, not just bringing us, people like myself, more to the west of the region, but we're also crossing over much more with fiscal policy. And I always say that we're all becoming macroeconomists now, right? We're all sort of learning the language of sovereign debt and bond yield rates and what have you. So we may be novices, but we're learning the language, and I think it's important that we do in order to demystify a lot of that sort of fiscal language. So, okay, let me just run. I have 2 slides, and I will talk through just a number of issues, hopefully to stimulate some discussion. So I'm going to start at 12 o'clock on this chart. It's patently obvious. In fact, it's so obvious that I think that sometimes we just run through the evidence very quickly and move on to other issues. But it's patently obvious, and there is clear, unequivocal evidence that health is being damaged as a result of the financial crisis, the economic crisis. There's a lot of research been done on this. The pathways are there. Typically, mental health is high on the sort of the health impact around mental health. But as we saw yesterday, it's not only about mental health, communicable disease programs and so on also being affected as a result of the financial crisis. We also know that the impacts of the financial crisis, and we do distinguish between financial and economic crisis. I think we often put those words together. I think financial crises tend to be where bubbles burst, banking failures, collapses, housing markets crash. The question is whether that translates then and knocks over into an economic crisis, recession, unemployment, and so on. And I think a lot of fiscal policy is often about to trying to contain financial crises and prevent them turning into economic crises. And I think it's economic crises where the health effects really start to kick in. But we know that the effects of financial and economic crisis on health, they kick in pretty quickly. The effects are seen pretty quickly. So I really wanted to start with this. As I said, it's so obvious, and I will come back to it later, that I think, in fact, on my 7 o'clock point, I'll say more a bit later, but I think we as WHO need to be much better at shining a very bright light on this fact, especially given all we tend to read about in the papers, or very much is about bailouts and the finance and debt ratios and so on. So moving clockwise, the second point there, universal health coverage. I think a couple of thoughts on that, and let me just move to the next slide. I mean, this is a big thing for WHO at the moment globally, the whole idea of universal health coverage. And you might say, so this is the report from 2010, Health Systems Financing, the Path to Universal Coverage. And you might quite rightly ask, why am I showing this here? Because this report was by and large driven by concerns in lower and middle income countries, particularly Asia. Great concern that many households were getting into severe financial distress as a result of having to pay for health services out of their own pocket, or even more catastrophic, not even seeking health care at all when they were sick. But we increasingly have concerns that those countries which have, over the last, let's say, the post-war period in Europe, established quite mature health systems fundamentally based on universal health coverage, are maybe now starting to retreat in certain aspects. And that's a great concern. So on the one hand, there's countries which are still striving to reach some elements of universal coverage, but there's also great concerns that those that have reached maybe are now starting to retreat. And some of you may know, I think it was, I'm losing track of time, yesterday or the day before, there was a resolution passed in the UN General Assembly, the UN General Assembly, all on universal health coverage, a very strong commitment. This comes under their global health and foreign policy agenda. Greece was a co-sponsor of that bill, and interestingly and very happily, the United States of America was also a co-sponsor of that bill, which quite probably it would not have been if the elections a few months back had been different in the United States. And I think that last point is quite, maybe not so much relevant to this audience, but for many countries around the world which idolize the US and follow their sort of development path. I think the signal has changed now in terms of, certainly with respect to how they manage their healthcare system. Should just take a drink. We see a mixed picture across Europe, and it does vary, as I sort of just explained. I mean, to the east of the region, we've seen examples of some countries actually moving to strengthen universal coverage during the midst of a financial crisis. There's very strong evidence that if a country has active, good labour market policies, if it has strong safety nets, and there are examples, I think, Sweden and a couple of other countries which have shown that even when you do have an economic crisis, greater unemployment, if you have strong safety nets and health and universal coverage is a fundamental part of broader social safety nets, as I said, labour policy, then you can mitigate quite successfully the negative effects on health of a recession. Let me move around to the third circle there. And this is more about how health systems are responding to extreme, to fiscal pressure. And I think the network, I don't like to use the word pigs at all, but it's still being used quite widely. But the countries which are formally part of some economic adjustment program with the Troika, there is an issue of policy making under extreme time pressure. And as I said, I've learned a lot. You all know this, but for me, working more and more in the west of Europe, the idea that the Troika come back every 3 months to see what progress and what measures have been taken in response to their previous recommendations is quite, to me, is quite astounding. I mean, I think in the early stages, and I would love to hear from the audience a little bit more about how things have played out in Greece. I was involved in quite a detailed report recently for the Irish government, so I know a little bit more there. But I think in the sort of year 1, year 2 of this crisis, you could argue there are some advantages to having these external pressure. And I've heard that from some policymakers. There can be a good side to it in that if you have real deadlock within a country in terms of moving forward on reforms, some external pressure, if it's managed well, if it can be negotiated well, can be beneficial to some point. Clearly also in the early stages of a recession, there may be measures that can be taken without damaging frontline health services. I mean, I think we, in general, and I deliberately make a generalization, I mean, I think it's fair to say that all healthcare systems have room for efficiency gains. I think that is probably a truth in almost all health systems, and we have to accept that. Certainly as WHO, I work on the financing and economic side, we certainly accept that. But the question then arises in prolonged recessions, when you get into years 3, 4, 5 of deep budget cuts, the extent to which it's possible to deliver further savings, further efficiency gains, once you've picked all your ripe fruit, finding further savings becomes much more difficult, and we're typically into much more complex territory of reconfiguring service delivery systems. Now, that's something which is important and something that I raise in my final box. But delivering savings through fundamental reconfiguration and reform of service delivery systems within 3 months or 6 months is just clearly not possible. So, and I think that's where the debate needs to go, and I think that's where, perhaps with some moderate success, I'm not sure others will comment, a piece of work that we did for the Irish government recently hopefully shone the spotlight on that trade-off very clearly. Okay, so I'll move on to my fourth point. I think it's the nature of healthcare systems that supply and demand are out of balance. I mean, I think supply outstrips demand in pretty much every healthcare system, be it rich or poor. Again, I'm kind of stating the obvious, but that imbalance tends to be even more polarized. And the trade-offs within healthcare systems, again, trade-offs which are always there, which even in good times policymakers are grappling with. In times of financial crisis, those trade-offs and that imbalance become extremely exacerbated. And I think this is where we start to cross over with fiscal policy more and more. again, stating the obvious, but we need to do it. We know that health typically deteriorates, not necessarily, but typically deteriorates at times of financial crisis, not least through the employment channel, as I mentioned. And so the needs are increased, specifically at a time when, if fiscal policy is not managed well, the supply side, if you like, is diminishing. And it's so patently obvious, yet I feel that sometimes, and I'm not making any commentary on Greece here because I know very little about the local policy environment here, but again, I come back to myself and my organisation to shine the light on those trade-offs, just so everyone's really crystal clear on exactly the impact of some of these fiscal decisions. The meeting in Oslo, as I mentioned earlier, just to go back to that, is very much, as I said, about bringing evidence to the table. It's a midpoint in a sense. The idea is that we take some recommendations to our regional committee meeting in September 2013 for some form of endorsement by all the member states of Europe with respect to some recommendations. Constantino put a list of, I think it was 12 recommendations from the 2009 meeting. When I read those, I mean, they're very sound, they're very, very sensible. I'm hoping this time round, 4 years on, we can be much more concrete on some issues. We may even, let's see what our political leaders say, but we may even stray a little bit into fiscal territory. I mean, it's clear that the interdependence between fiscal policy and health policy, of course, is very, very tight. The fiscal guys increasingly look at health as a big spender, you know, maybe after pensions, the number 2 spender of the public purse, and with concerns over sustainability of public finances. The fiscal guys, if you look at the European Commission, I don't know if we have any representatives here. I mean, I think, you know, the fiscal agenda is very much trumping the health agenda. But it works both ways. If fiscal policy is badly managed, it goes without saying that the health sector is going to suffer heavily as a result, given the dependence typically of health systems on public finance. So it's a two-way street, and I think, as I say, typically the messages come from the fiscal guys to the health guys, but I think it would be nice to send some clear messages back, certainly from our organisation, representing the health guys, back to the fiscal guys. We get into issues here. I won't go into it too much, and in a sense, I'm linking the two bottom points here as I speak. But the whole issue of, for example, counter-cyclical spending in broader fiscal policy. I think Ireland's a very bad example of that. Pro-cyclical spending when the economy was on fire in a positive sense, roaring ahead, very high levels of growth. What we saw for 5-year period between 2007 and 2012 in Ireland is that growth in spending on health was 25% greater than growth in the general economy. So a huge sort of pro-cyclical spending in health there. And in fact, I think the opposite was true in Greece, so it didn't suffer in that sense. But a massive hangover, and coming out of that hangover is quite traumatic and politically very, very difficult to significantly reduce the salaries of doctors is not an easy thing to do. So that's what we're aiming to do. I mean, we're working out the details now, and Greece is part of as you know, this network which is going to be producing, which we're now in the process of pulling together in a systematic way some of the evidence on all these issues with a view to presenting them at the meeting in Oslo and feeding into some form of endorsement. It may not be a full resolution, but some form of political endorsement in the Regional Committee next year. And then just two final points. This issue of, I've put there, unpicking the Troika. Again, this is getting into fiscal territory, but I think increasingly there are commentators who are looking at the IMF and saying, well, actually the IMF has a lot of experience of getting out of the type of problem that Greece is facing now in pure fiscal terms. It learnt the hard way in Latin America. It got it wrong for 10 years, and then it started to get some things right. And there is a pathway out of this. The IMF, of course, has always had its critics over the years, but I think things are changing a little bit now with its new leader. And there are commentators saying that the IMF is not expressing some of these policies which could actually help countries such as Greece get out of where it is, start to turn them in a more positive direction. And they're, in a sense, being dictated to within the Troika by the short-term political priorities of the European member states. So that's something I can throw out there for debate. And then my final point is to say that all the, in a sense, short-term responses which we see in many health systems, often somewhat reactive, perhaps as a result of this extreme time pressure that I referred to. You know, often the easy thing to do is to put a user fee, a patient charge on something new, or to increase an existing patient user charge. That's something that can be done pretty quickly. Fundamentally tackling some of the more structural issues within health systems is more difficult. But those decisions that are made in the short term, they lay new foundations, in a sense, for the health system. And amongst, in a sense, I'm back to the top here, talking about health. It's very easy to forget about health a little bit amidst all this sort of fiscal discussion. But there are great challenges for health systems, irrespective of the financial crisis. We know where the burden of disease lies. It's largely around non-communicable diseases. We know that tackling risk factors can sort of handle around 50% or avoid around 50%, the rest being through treatment of those risk factors. And we don't tackle risk factors in hospitals. Hospitals, of course, have a role to play, but fundamentally, the challenge is outside hospitals and indeed outside the health system. And I think that's something which is not always easy to do, but it's critical that in the midst of this crisis, and I'm glad I'm not in a position to have to deal with it directly, but it's critical that we keep an eye on the longer term challenges facing health and health systems, and that we're not actually going down a different path as a result of short term decision making.